So, hi everyone, I'm Ewan. I'm a lecturer at Newcastle University in work and employment. So, I don't want to make this sound too academic today. I'm also a musician as well, and I know David through music circles. So, I think musician might be pushing it a bit, right?
I think musician.
So, I'm one of these people, and I sympathise with a lot of the things that have been said so far. Whether I'm working class or middle class, I'm not sure, but I know that I wouldn't be able to do the role that I'm in now if I was younger. I wouldn't have access to it. So I studied music in London, and that was the tuition fees were paid for. I got a bursary for my master's degree. I got a scholarship for a PhD. All of the things that funded my education have now gone. So, working in a university, I often see firsthand the effects of barriers like tuition fees and the creation of a class society, or the recreation of a class society, we might say. One of the things I've been looking at though is something called hope labour, which is the idea that people would work for free or in an undercompensated way to gain some kind of employment in the future. So it's not necessarily always about economic security. It's also about having your painting on the wall or just taking part in something. We, as creative people, we all love to produce art, and a lot of that is driven not necessarily by money, of course. It's the creative itch, social responsibility to others, the magic of creativity. So I wanted to look at this because it's a very good intersection of people's creative motivations and the economy that they're up against. And what is interesting about hope labour is it's sort of naturalised. It's made normal by a lot of the government discourses that we're subject to. One of them is the creative industries, I have to say, which I don't think is a good term. I don't think it's useful, and I think we need to change that actually, because the idea that creativity in itself is industrial poses lots of problems. That's the first point. So I've looked at this sort of economisation of the arts, if that makes sense. And the idea of hope labour is that I wanted to see why people were doing it really, because it is sort of understood as a form of self-exploitation. So it's the idea that we're all set up to be inferior, as you've covered, Joanne, I think. And also this idea that the arts aren't ring-fenced anymore in any way. They're not necessarily funded. So we have to present ourselves as sort of marketable enterprises. We have to sort of accumulate learning experiences and go and be part of social networks. And I think the example of TV and film is very interesting in this sense, because the broadcasters, the big broadcasters like the BBC, have broken up now. It's basically made up of freelance groups of technicians, camera crews and such. And they're not governed by any kind of employment law. They're basically self-employed people who work in social networks and in teams. So there's a lot at stake in these kind of relationships. So what is interesting about that is I think working class people are quick to discount hope labour, because it's really only some people that are afforded the time and resources to do this, and this goes back to the point that you were making, John. So hope labour is, on one level, a sort of middle class activity, because to invest in yourself, to give yourself the opportunities to have these experiences, you need time and resources to do that. But it's kind of built into the society that we live in as well. So if I give you an example, at the university, I was party to a discussion where there was some funding from a research body who shall remain nameless, and they had a full-time position. And the executives in the room said, well, why don't we break that up into 2.5s and we'll get 0.75 out of both of them. Now, there's this kind of idea where, the opportunity is there, but it's also a form of exploitation. And it's almost this idea where passion is your sort of enemy, right? It's the elephant in the room. And I think a lot of what happens here is we've addressed the creative industries as a sort of economic sphere. And that's not to say that we don't need paid and we don't need to earn a living. Of course that's true. But it's just to say that it should be funded. And appropriate funding needs to go to the proper places. One of the things about Hope labourers as well, which is quite important, is they're sort of grave diggers for their own career and the career of others. So when people are working for free in, say, TV and film or in music, they are undermining the value of labour in the sector they want to work in, which is an ironic sort of cyclical sort of pattern. So obviously unionisation comes into this. We need pay rates. We need to have a sort of collective response rather than individual sort of career orientation. So we need to stop talking about individuals and their careers. We need to talk about how people organise and have a debate about that. The problem with pay rates, of course, and I spoke to many artists about this, they're useless, they've told me. Broadly speaking, why? Because people will do it for nothing. There's so many people in the room that will just put their hand up and say, I'll do that. I'll take that opportunity. So when the chips are down, it's almost like it's almost like a sort of vicious circle, if that makes sense. In terms of responses, it's very difficult to think about this other than sort of large-scale structural political upheaval, really. Sorry, I don't mean to sound negative. Obviously, unionisation is needed, and I'm sure Lorraine will fill us in on that. I think as well, you know, when we're talking about funding, we need to think about what that funding is for. A lot of the time, funding comes with caveats about increasing industry impact, uses words like marketability. You know, how are you going to make this meaningful, and who are you going to employ? Is one of the ones that the funding bodies quite often say. But I think we need to say, okay, art's for art's sake. It's an old argument. Can we park that, and can we give that to people? Because that in itself, as some people have argued, is almost like a cultural necessity, right? Like water, food. You know, we could look at culture on these terms as well. It's like something that has to come before everything else. It enables us to be human and to live freely and well. I've done some work on universal basic income, which is controversial, of course. I'm not sure about it, to be honest, because obviously one of the issues with universal basic income is if you introduce it into a market economy, then the market responds to that, right? So it may mean we see prices coming up, rents going up and such like. So I'm not sure it's the solution, but it's certainly an interesting idea if it's in combination with services and things. And also, how do we? I think the important thing is how do we unionise as you know, people who are aware of this issue. We're aware that there's a growing working class community that doesn't have access to the arts and is excluded. How do we bring them in? How do we advocate for a collective voice, and how do we make that possible? And I think that is about, you know, holding a line rather than undercutting each other and using language like opportunities and exposure and learning experiences and such like. Okay, I think that's me. Thank you.